9:15 in the morning. The aircraft carrier USS Nimitz was already adjusting its course to keep the wind over the flight deck. Something was appearing on the long-range search radar that did not match any commercial flight or shipping lanes. The air over the Persian Gulf was thick with 90% humidity and the heavy, stinging smell of jet fuel. Below the flight deck, in the Combat Direction Center, the quiet murmur of routine operations was replaced by a sudden, sharp focus. The carrier was transiting the eastern reaches of the Persian Gulf, approximately 40 miles south of the Iranian coastline. For the crew of Carrier Strike Group 11, the mission was a standard freedom of navigation transit, but the electronic environment had changed within the last 6 minutes. The SPS-49 air search radar and the surface search suites began picking up multiple small, high-speed returns emerging from the haze near the Iranian naval base at Bandar Abbas. At first, the contacts appeared as a disorganized cluster of white dots on the digital displays, but as the distance closed to 25 miles, the pattern became clear. These were not fishing vessels or commercial dhows. They were Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy fast attack craft, moving in a coordinated, multi-axis swarm. The radar operator counted 10, then 20, and finally 40 distinct signatures. They were cutting through the water at 45 knots, their bow waves throwing white plumes into the morning sun. On the flag bridge, the admiral commanding the strike group stood over the tactical plot. The professional discipline of the United States Navy was on full display. There was no shouting, only the steady, rhythmic reporting of coordinates and headings. The commanding officer of the USS Nimitz stood beside him, watching the data feed from the escorting ships. 2 miles ahead of the carrier, the destroyer DDG-51 and the cruiser CG-73 were already shifting their positions. They were moving to form a protective screen, putting thousands of tons of steel between the swarming fast boats and the multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier. The threat was not just the speed of the Iranian vessels, but their numbers. Each boat was small, likely no more than 15 meters in length, but they were known to carry heavy machine guns, rocket launchers, and in some cases, short-range anti-ship missiles. In a swarm of 40, they represented a saturation threat designed to overwhelm the defensive fire control systems of even the most advanced warships. The air inside the Combat Direction Center was cool, a sharp contrast to the searing heat on the flight deck above. The only sounds were the hum of high-powered computers and the low, calm voices of the sailors. The electronic warfare supervisor reported that the Iranian boats were running without radio transmission, maintaining strict emissions control to avoid detection, though their physical speed had already betrayed their intent. All contacts classified as hostile intent, the tactical action officer announced. The words were recorded instantly into the ship's log. This was the moment the mission shifted from a transit to a potential engagement. The hook-shaped formation of the Iranian swarm was designed to encircle the carrier, coming in from the north, the east, and the northeast simultaneously. It was a classic pincer movement, executed with a level of precision that suggested this was a pre-planned operation rather than a random encounter. The carrier's massive engines, 4 Westinghouse nuclear reactors driving 4 bronze propellers, pushed the ship forward at 30 knots. The vibration of the hull was a constant, low-frequency thrumming that could be felt in the soles of every sailor's boots. On the flight deck, the yellow-shirted handlers were moving with increased urgency. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets were already hooked into the catapults, their engines whining as they prepared for an emergency launch. The pilots sat in their cockpits, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sea met the pale blue sky. The distance closed to 15 miles. At this range, the high-resolution cameras on the carrier's mast could begin to resolve the shapes of the individual boats. They were bogomers and fast attack craft, painted in sea gray, bouncing violently over the choppy waves of the Gulf. The lead boats were already beginning to fan out, widening their formation to make themselves harder targets for the carrier's defensive guns. The United States Navy operates under strict rules of engagement, and the transition to lethal force is a tiered process. The commanding officer issued the order to begin the first level of the protocol. High-powered loudspeakers and long-range acoustic devices were aimed at the approaching swarm. The warnings were broadcast in English and Farsi. a clear, booming command for the vessels to alter their course or face the consequences. The response from the Iranian boats was absolute silence. They did not slow down. They did not change course. Instead, they increased their speed to 50 knots. The unanswered question hung in the air of the bridge. Was this a massive show of force intended to intimidate the American carrier? Or was it the opening move of a coordinated strike? The crew of the USS Nimitz had their answer as the first Iranian boat crossed the 10-mile mark, entering the inner defensive zone of the strike group. The tension on the ship was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a physical weight felt by every man and woman at their battle stations. 9:20 in the morning. The Persian Gulf was a sheet of hammered silver under the mounting heat of the sun, but the tactical situation was rapidly darkening. The distance between the USS Nimitz and the lead elements of the Iranian fast attack craft was closing at a combined speed of nearly 80 knots. At coordinates 26 degrees 42 minutes north, longitude 55 degrees 18 minutes east, the United States Navy began the formal escalation of its defensive protocols. The bridge of the carrier was a hive of controlled, professional energy, with every sailor focused on the digital representation of the 40 threats closing in from the north. The commanding officer of the USS Nimitz gave the order to initiate the second tier of the strike group's warning procedures. On the starboard catwalks, sailors manned the long-range acoustic devices, aiming the hexagonal gray dishes directly at the lead Iranian vessels. These devices emitted a piercing, high-frequency beam of sound that could be heard clearly even over the roar of the fast boat's outboard engines. The sound was designed to cause physical discomfort and to signal, beyond any doubt, that the approaching vessels were entering a restricted defensive bubble. Simultaneously, the communications officer continued to broadcast on Maritime Channel 16, his voice calm and steady as he repeated the warning that the strike group was prepared to take defensive measures. 3 miles ahead of the carrier, the destroyer DDG-51, the USS Arleigh Burke, began to execute its role as the primary screen. The destroyer's 5-inch 54 caliber gun turret rotated smoothly, tracking the lead group of 10 boats. Instead of firing live ammunition, the destroyer launched a series of white phosphorus flares into the sky. The flares erupted in brilliant bursts of light, trailing long streamers of white smoke that hung in the humid air like jagged scars. It was a visual stop sign, a wall of burning magnesium intended to show the Iranian commanders exactly where the line was drawn. The air around the carrier strike group began to smell of ozone and the sharp, chemical bite of pyrotechnic smoke. Despite the visual and acoustic warnings, the Iranian swarm showed no signs of hesitation. The 40 boats remained in their tight, aggressive formations, bouncing over the 2-meter swells with reckless speed. Through high-powered optics, the American lookouts could see the Iranian crews. They were wearing dark life jackets and helmets, some standing behind mounted 12.7mm heavy machine guns, while others readied shoulder-fired rocket launchers. The intent was no longer a matter of debate. It was a demonstrated reality. At 9:28 in the morning, the lead boats crossed the 8-mile mark. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the Nimitz, the Tactical Action Officer watched the icons on the screen turn from yellow to a steady, pulsing red. The cruiser, CG-73, positioned on the carrier's port quarter, reported that its ANSPY-1 radar was now providing firing solutions for every single target in the swarm. The complexity of the task was immense. The Aegis combat system was processing 40 separate tracks, calculating the speed, bearing, and estimated time of arrival for each one. The system was designed to handle hundreds of incoming missiles, and against these small surface targets, its precision was absolute. The admiral commanding the strike group stood at the center of the flag bridge, his arms crossed. He was weighing the geopolitical consequences of an engagement against the immediate safety of the 5,000 sailors under his command. The rules of engagement were clear. Once a swarm of this size reached the 5-mile exclusion zone without responding to warnings, it was classified as a clear and present danger. At 5 miles, a fast boat traveling at 50 knots can close the distance to the carrier's hull in less than 6 minutes. That time frame left no room for error and even less for second-guessing. The environment on the flight deck had shifted to a state of total combat readiness. The two Fa-18 Super Hornets on the waist catapults were now at full power, their twin engines shaking the entire aftersection of the ship with a deafening, low-frequency roar. The heat blur behind the jets distorted the view of the escort ships, making the destroyer DDG-51 look like a shimmering ghost on the water. The flight deck crews, wearing their color-coded jerseys, moved with practiced efficiency, clearing the area for an immediate launch. 9:32 in the morning. The lead element of the Iranian swarm, a group of 5 Boghammer fast boats, crossed the 5-mile threshold. They were now within the inner defensive ring of the strike group. On the bridge of the Nimitz, the commanding officer picked up the internal handset. His voice was transmitted across every deck and every compartment of the 90,000-ton ship. All hands, man your battle stations. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. The sounding of general quarters followed, a rhythmic, electronic gonging that signaled the transition of the USS Nimitz from a floating airfield into a fully realized instrument of war. The Iranian vessels were now so close that the white spray from their hulls was visible to the naked eye from the carrier's flight deck. They began to fan out even further, attempting to saturate the carrier's defenses by attacking from multiple angles. It was a calculated gamble, a test of American resolve in the world's most volatile waterway. The unanswered question of the morning was about to be settled with the weight of naval tradition and the kinetic force of modern weaponry. 9:35 in the morning. The aircraft carrier USS Nimitz was no longer a solitary target, but the center of a coordinated defensive web known as the Wall of Steel. At coordinates 26 degrees 41 minutes north, longitude 55 degrees 20 minutes east, the tactical deployment of Carrier Strike Group 11 reached its final, lethal configuration. The destroyer, DDG-51, and the cruiser, CG-73, were now executing high-speed flanking maneuvers, their hulls cutting deep, white furrows into the green water of the Gulf as they moved to intercept the path of the Iranian swarm. The air around the carrier was thick with the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the ship's massive ventilation systems, and the distant, high-pitched whine of the gas turbine engines from the escorting destroyer. The destroyer, positioned 3,000 yards off the carrier's starboard bow, leaned hard into a turn, its 5-inch 54 caliber gun turret locked onto the leading edge of the Iranian formation. On the decks of the escort ships, sailors in flash gear and life vests manned the 25mm Mark 38 chain guns, their optics tracking the bouncing shapes of the fast attack craft through thermal sights that cut through the morning haze. Inside the carrier's bridge wing, the lookouts reported that the 40 Iranian boats had split into 3 distinct attack groups. The largest group, consisting of 20 vessels, was driving straight for the carrier's midsection, while 2 smaller groups of 10 were attempting to loop around the bow and stern. This was a classic saturation tactic, designed to force the American defensive systems to divide their attention across 360 degrees. The tactical action officer on the Nimitz coordinated the fire sectors, assigning the northern group to the cruiser and the southern group to the destroyer, while the carrier's own organic defenses prepared for the central thrust. The physical sensation of the ship had changed. The Nimitz was now vibrating with the power of its 4-geared steam turbines, pushing the 97,000 tons of steel to a flank speed of 32 knots. The wind over the flight deck was a steady, warm gale that carried the sharp scent of salt spray mixed with the acrid metallic tang of machinery running at maximum capacity. On the flight deck, the final safety checks were completed for the 2 Fa-18 Super Hornets. With a sudden, chest-compressing roar, the first jet was slammed forward by the steam catapult, disappearing into the haze in less than 2 seconds, followed immediately by the second. The deployment was not limited to the surface. Above the strike group, the 2 Super Hornets began a low-level show-of-force maneuver. They dropped to an altitude of only 500 feet, screaming over the Iranian boats at 500 knots. The sonic booms shattered the air, sending massive pressure waves across the water that physically rocked the smaller Iranian vessels. It was the final non-lethal card the United States Navy could play. The pilots reported back to the carrier that the Iranian crews were not wavering. Instead, they were uncovering their rocket launchers and pointing them toward the sky. On the carrier's starboard and port catwalks, the Phalanx close-in weapon systems, the R2-D2 shaped radar-controlled guns, began their automated search and track cycles. The white domes rotated with jerky, robotic precision, their 20mm Gatling guns pointing directly at the water's surface. Each system was capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute, creating a literal curtain of tungsten bullets. Beside them, the Mark 29 launchers for the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles and the rolling airframe missile launchers were armed and set to weapons-free status for any target crossing the 3-mile line. The professional discipline of the American sailors remained absolute. In the engine rooms, the machinists' mates monitored the steam pressures with unwavering focus, ensuring the ship had every ounce of maneuverability required. In the medical bays, teams were laid out with trauma kits and stretchers, prepared for the honest reality of combat at sea. The United States Navy had spent decades training for this specific scenario, a high-intensity swarm attack in a confined waterway. And every manual, every drill, and every simulation was now being translated into physical action. 9:40 in the morning. The lead Iranian Bagamar, a fast boat equipped with multiple launch rocket systems, breached the 4-mile perimeter. It was now within the effective range of the carrier's medium-caliber guns. On the bridge, the commanding officer watched the digital rangefinder countdown. The next move would not be a broadcast or a flare. It would be the decisive application of American naval power. 9:41 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. On the flag bridge of the USS Nimitz, the silence was heavy, broken only by the low-frequency hum of the air filtration and the steady, clicking sound of the tactical plot updating. At this range, the high-definition infrared cameras on the carrier's island showed the individual spray patterns of the 40 vessels as they bounced through the swell. The engagement order was no longer a question of if, but when. The admiral commanding the strike group stood at the secure satellite communications console. The link to Central Command in Florida was active, providing a real-time data stream of the escalating threat. The conversation was brief and clinical. The rules of engagement had been met. Hostile intent had been demonstrated by the swarm's refusal to veer off, their high-speed approach into the exclusion zone, and the uncovering of weapon systems. At 9:43, the voice of the Deputy Commander of Central Command came through the headset, clear and unmistakable. Strike Group 11, you are authorized to defend the force, weapons free, neutralize the surface threat. Copy that, Central Command. Weapons free, the Admiral replied. He turned to the commanding officer of the USS Nimitz and the tactical action officer. The order was relayed instantly through the ship's internal circuits. All stations, this is the captain. We are weapons free. Engage all hostile surface contacts inside 5 miles. Clear the zone. The transition from a state of high alert to active combat was seamless, the result of thousands of hours of drills. On the starboard and port catwalks, the gun crews for the 25mm Mark 38 chain guns adjusted their helmets and checked their feeds. These weapons, capable of firing 200 rounds per minute of high-explosive ammunition, were the primary defense against small, fast-moving surface targets. The sailors operating them felt the deck shudder as the carrier maintained its 32-knot sprint, the wind screaming through the radar masts above. The air around the carrier began to smell of hot oil, and the ozone of high-powered electronics pushed to their limits. In the Combat Direction Center, the air-conditioned chill was forgotten as the tactical action officer began assigning targets to the various defensive layers. The cruiser CG-73, the USS Lake Erie, was assigned the northern group of 10 boats. The destroyer DDG-51, the USS Arleigh Burke, was given the southern group. The 20 boats in the central swarm, driving straight for the Nimitz, were the responsibility of the carrier's own organic gun batteries. The Aegis combat system on the escort ships began to sing. On the destroyer, the 5-inch 54 caliber gun was already slewing toward its first target. The technical precision of the United States Navy was about to be converted into kinetic energy. The targeting computers calculated the lead for each boat, accounting for the roll of the sea and the erratic pitching of the Iranian bombers. The coordinates were locked at 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 55 degrees 22 minutes east. On the flight deck, the two Fa-18 Super Hornets that had just launched were banking hard, their pilots looking down at the swarm. They were carrying AGM-65 Maverick missiles and 20mm internal cannons. The lead pilot clicked his radio. "Raven 1-1, I have a solid lock on the center mass group, requesting permission to engage with the internal gun." The carrier's air boss responded immediately. "Raven 1-1, you are cleared hot. Engage and brake." The sensation of the ship was one of immense, coiled power. The USS Nimitz was no longer just a platform for aircraft, it was a fortress of steel and fire. In the hangar bay, the crew stood by with firefighting equipment, their faces set in grim masks of professional focus. The roar of the ocean against the hull was a constant reminder of the stakes. If even one of those boats carried a heavy-shaped charge, or a high-explosive warhead, and managed to strike the hull, the damage could be catastrophic. 9:45 in the morning. The lead Iranian boat was now 2.5 miles away, its bow rising and falling as it punched through the waves. The American gunners could now see the muzzle flashes of the 12.7mm machine guns on the Iranian vessels as they began to fire wildly toward the carrier. The rounds fell short, splashing into the green water, but the intent was now a physical act of war. The commanding officer of the Nimitz gripped the edge of the bridge console. He looked at the tactical action officer and gave the final, local command. That would change the history of the day. Mark 38 batteries, Phalanx systems, and Raven flight. Open fire. The silence of the morning was shattered. The first shot did not come from a rifle or a cannon, but from the destroyer Arleigh Burke, which unleashed its 5-inch gun with a bone-shaking crack that rolled across the water like a clap of thunder. The engagement had begun. The unanswered question of how the swarm would react to lethal force was about to be answered in a rain of steel and fire. 9:46 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. At coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 55 degrees 22 minutes east, the USS Nimitz was no longer a silent observer of the Iranian swarm, but the active epicenter of a devastating storm of steel. The first kinetic response came from the starboard side of the carrier, where the 25mm Mark 38 chain gun mounts were situated. The air around the gun sponsons was instantly filled with the deafening, rhythmic thumping of high-speed mechanical action, a sound that could be felt deep in the chest of every sailor nearby. The first shot from the destroyer, Arleigh Burke's 5-inch gun, had already struck the water hundreds of yards ahead of the Iranian-led boat, sending a massive plume of white spray into the air as a ranging shot. But the engagement transitioned to lethal finality in a matter of seconds. The carrier's own gunners, wearing their heavy ballistic vests and tinted visors, locked their thermal sights onto the lead Boghammer fast boat, which was now less than 2 miles away and closing. The gunners squeezed the dual triggers of the Mark 38. The weapon shrieked as it cycled, spitting out a continuous stream of orange tracers that arched across the bright morning sky. Each high-explosive incendiary round, an inch in diameter, was traveling at over 1,100 meters per second. The smell of burnt powder and hot lubricant washed over the gun crew, a sharp, chemical bite that signaled the end of the standoff. The first burst of 20 rounds punched straight through the fiberglass hull of the lead Iranian vessel, the kinetic energy alone shattering the light structure like glass. The boat's internal fuel tank, filled with high-octane gasoline, erupted instantly into a massive, roiling fireball that bleached the blue sky white for a fraction of a second. The Iranian crew was sent flying into the churned water as the boat disintegrated, the bow section rising 5 meters into the air before slamming back down in a tangle of burning debris and twisted metal. The second boat in the formation tried to veer hard to port to avoid the wreckage, its hull leaning at a precarious 45-degree angle, but the American gunner did not let go. The stream of tracers followed the turn, walking across the water in a series of white geysers before finding the target again. The rounds shredded the outboard engines, the metal housings exploding into fragments that skipped across the surface of the sea. The boat lost all power instantly, the nose dipping into a swell and causing the entire craft to cartwheel, ejecting personnel and equipment into the widening oil slick. Black, oily smoke rose in a thick column from the two destroyed vessels, marking the exact spot where the exclusion zone had been breached. The remaining 38 Iranian boats did not retreat. Instead, they appeared to panic, their tight formations breaking apart into a chaotic scramble. Some boats began to fire their 12.7mm machine guns toward the carrier's hull, the small caliber rounds pinging harmlessly against the thick steel armor of the Nimitz, while others launched unguided rockets that spiraled wildly into the air, splashing miles away from any target. The transition from a coordinated attack to a desperate struggle for survival took less than 60 seconds. Inside the carrier's bridge, the commanding officer watched the thermal feed of the destruction. The professionalism of the crew was unwavering. The gunners were already slewing their weapons toward the next group of targets, their movements precise and practiced. The wall of lead was now being reinforced by the Phalanx close-in weapon systems on the aft quarters of the ship. The white domes hummed with a high-pitched electrical whine as they locked onto the closest surface threats. When the first Phalanx opened fire, the sound was not a series of shots, but a continuous, terrifying buzz, like a giant circular saw cutting through the atmosphere. The ocean around the carrier was being transformed into a graveyard of fiberglass and fuel. The 30-knot wind, created by the carrier's speed, began to pull the smoke from the first two kills back along the length of the ship, creating a dark shroud that the American sensors easily saw through. The tactical situation was now one of total dominance. The Iranian swarm had expected the carrier to be a passive target or to rely solely on its escorting ships. They had not accounted for the sheer volume of organic fire the Nimitz could project from its own decks. 9:49 in the morning. The engagement was barely 3 minutes old, but the lead element of the Iranian pincer had been effectively vaporized. The tactical action officer reported that 4 more boats had been disabled by the destroyer's 5-inch gun, their structures smashed by the pressure waves of the heavy shells detonating in the water nearby. The central group of 20 boats was now within 1,000 yards of the carrier's starboard side, moving into the kill box where every gun battery on the ship could bear. The air was thick with the sound of the engagement, the cracks of the larger guns, the buzz of the Phalanx, and the distant, hollow booms of the Iranian rockets. 9:50 in the morning. The central cluster of 20 Iranian fast attack craft had closed to within 1,200 yards of the starboard hull of the USS Nimitz, a distance that rendered the tactical situation a matter of immediate survival. At coordinates 26 degrees 39 minutes north, longitude 55 degrees 24 minutes east, the United States Navy executed the most concentrated application of short-range defensive fire ever recorded in the Persian Gulf. The air around the carrier was no longer transparent. It was a churning haze of gray cordite smoke, white steam from the catapults, and the shimmering distortion of thousands of degrees of heat rising from the gun barrels. The commanding officer of the Nimitz, standing on the starboard bridge wing behind armored glass, gave the final authorization for the integrated defensive network to engage at maximum cyclic rates. The primary focus shifted to the Phalanx close-in weapon systems. The 4 white, dome-topped mounts on the carrier's corners began their automated kill cycles. The sound was not a series of individual shots, but a continuous, earth-shaking vibration that resonated through the entire 97,000-ton hull of the ship. The trigger was squeezed on the forward starboard Phalanx. The 20mm Gatling gun shrieked as it spun to full speed, spitting a solid stream of tungsten armor-piercing rounds at 75 rounds per second. The white tracers created a physical bridge of light between the carrier and the lead Iranian boat. The heat blast from the muzzle washed across the catwalks, the temperature rising instantly by 20 degrees in the immediate vicinity of the mount. The smell of burning sulfur and ozone blotted out the salt air as the system tracked the target with robotic, unblinking precision. The lead Bagamar fast boat, traveling at 52 knots, was caught directly in the center of the tungsten stream. The high-density rounds punched through the fiberglass hull and the cast iron engine blocks as if they were wet paper. The boat did not merely catch fire, it disintegrated. The kinetic energy of the rounds caused the vessel to structurally fail. In less than 1 second, the bow shearing off and the midsection erupting in a violent orange-black blossom of flame that rose 12 meters into the air. The explosion was so intense that the shock wave flattened the surrounding waves, creating a momentary circle of white water amidst the green sea. The following vessels in the Iranian formation reacted with a mixture of panic and desperation. The pilots kicked their rudders hard to the left and right, their hulls sliding sideways across the water in a frantic attempt to break the radar lock of the American systems. One fast boat, attempting an evasive zigzag, collided at full speed with the vessel directly behind it. The two boats locked together in a tangle of splintering fiberglass and screaming engines. Before the crews could even attempt to jump clear, a burst from a 25mm Mark 38 chain gun tore through both hulls. The high-explosive rounds shredded the personnel and the equipment, sending jagged pieces of metal and white debris flying 50 meters into the air. The immediate aftermath was a scene of total tactical collapse for the Iranian swarm. A thick, roiling wall of black smoke and burning gasoline now separated the USS Nimitz from the remains of the central attack group. The surface of the water was no longer visible beneath a layer of flaming fuel and bobbing white fragments of what had been 40 fast attack craft only 10 minutes prior. The sound of the engagement began to shift from the continuous roar of the ship's guns to the distant, hollow pops of small arms ammunition cooking off in the burning wrecks. From above, the two Fa-18 Super Hornets of Raven flight began their final strafing runs on the outliers. The pilots, looking down through their heads-up displays, saw a graveyard of burning hulls. They rolled their aircraft into 40-degree dives, the 20mm internal cannons barking in short, precise bursts. The rounds walked across the water, kicking up lines of white geysers before finding the remaining boats that were attempting to flee back toward the Iranian coast. The aircraft moved with a grace that masked the lethal power of their munitions, each pass resulting in another fireball on the horizon. In the Combat Direction Center, the Tactical Action Officer monitored the screen as the red icons flickered and disappeared one by one. The count was down to 6. Of the original 40 vessels, 34 had been confirmed, destroyed or dead in the water. The cruiser Lake Erie reported that its sector was clear, with 3 burning hulls settling into the sea. The destroyer Arleigh Burke had ceased firing its 5-inch gun, its crew now transitioning to damage assessment and monitoring the surrounding airspace for any retaliatory drone or missile launches. The professional discipline of the strike group remained unbroken. There was no cheering on the bridge, only the steady reporting of remaining fuel states and ammunition counts. The United States Navy had executed its defensive protocol with a clinical efficiency that left no room for the Iranian swarm to achieve its objective. The cost to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy was absolute. 40% of their regional fast attack capability had been vaporized in less than 15 minutes. The USS Nimitz continued its transit, its massive wake cutting through the oil-slicked water as the crew prepared for the next phase of the mission. 9:55 in the morning. The Gulf air was heavy with the black, oily smoke rising from the debris field of the Iranian swarm. On the flight deck of the USS Nimitz, the tempo of operations shifted from defense to pursuit. While the carrier's internal guns had broken the back of the central attack, 6 Iranian fast boats were now attempting to flee toward the safety of the shallow coastal waters near Keshem Island. At coordinates 26 degrees 38 minutes north, longitude 55 degrees 28 minutes east, the United States Navy launched its most versatile aerial asset to close the escape route. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, already idling on the aft spots of the flight deck, lifted off into the shimmering heat. The vibration of the twin turboshaft engines pulsed through the deck plating, a rhythmic pounding that competed with the whistling wind. As the helicopters transitioned from a hover to forward flight, the door gunners adjusted their M240 machine guns, their eyes scanning the water through the haze. The air smelled of burnt JP-5 aviation fuel and the lingering metallic tang of the ship's recent gun battle. The lead helicopter, callsign Hunter 1-2, banked hard to the northeast. The pilot looked through his night vision and thermal imaging system, which projected a clear, white-hot image of the fleeing targets onto his helmet-mounted display. The Iranian boats were 5 miles away, their wakes creating long, white streaks against the dark water. They were pushing their engines to the limit, but they could not outrun the 150 knots of the American helicopters. Target acquired. The co-pilot of Hunter 1-2 announced over the internal net. He manipulated the laser designator on the helicopter's nose, placing a pulsing infrared beam on the stern of the furthest Iranian boat. On the side of the helicopter, the rails of the M299 launcher held 4 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. These laser-guided weapons were designed to strike with surgical precision, carrying a 20-pound high-explosive anti-tank warhead that would make short work of a fiberglass hull. The co-pilot pressed the launch stud. With a sharp, sudden whoosh, the Hellfire missile ignited, leaping off the rail and trailing a thin ribbon of gray smoke. The missile accelerated to Mach 1.3 in 3 seconds. Its seeker head locked onto the laser spot dancing on the Iranian boat's transom. The crew of the fast boat never saw it coming. The missile struck the engine compartment at an angle of 40 degrees, the shaped charged jet punching through the metal block and detonating the onboard fuel. The resulting explosion was a compact, violent orb of red fire that momentarily blotted out the target. When the smoke cleared, the boat was gone, replaced by a circular patch of white foam and a few charred pieces of debris that were quickly swallowed by the wake of the next boat in line. The second helicopter, Hunter 1-4, followed suit, engaging 2 more targets with rapid, back-to-back missile strikes. The efficiency of the aerial interdiction was absolute. The Iranian sailors had no defensive systems capable of targeting the high-altitude helicopters. Below the aircraft, the Fa-18 Super Hornets of Raven Flight maintained a high-cover orbit, their sensors mapping the entire northern sector of the Gulf to ensure no second wave was approaching from the Iranian mainland. The pilots reported that the Iranian coastal radar stations were active and painting the strike group with search beams, but no further aircraft or surface vessels were moving to intervene. The professional discipline of the United States Navy had turned a chaotic swarm into a series of isolated, terminal engagements. The final 2 Iranian boats, realizing that escape was impossible, cut their engines and began to circle in the water, their crews raising white pieces of cloth or simply jumping into the sea. The helicopters transitioned to a hovering orbit 300 feet above the survivors, their door gunners keeping the weapons trained on the water. The air was filled with the heavy, low-frequency beat of the rotors, a sound that signaled the end of the kinetic phase of the morning. 10:15 in the morning. The engagement was over. The search and rescue phase was now the priority, though the tactical action officer on the Nimitz reminded all units to remain at general quarters. The threat of a Trojan horses or a hidden explosive device remained a reality in these waters. The United States Navy had successfully defended the carrier, neutralized the swarm, and was now moving to document the results of the encounter. The debris field stretched for nearly 10 miles, a testament to the devastating power of a modern carrier strike group when pushed to its limits. 10:20 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, at coordinates 26 degrees 38 minutes north, longitude 55 degrees 28 minutes east, had transitioned from a high-speed kill zone into a 10-mile stretch of burning wreckage and thick, black oil. The aircraft carrier USS Nimitz maintained its steady course at 15 knots, its massive wake cutting a clean path through the shimmering, fuel-slicked water. While the primary engagement had concluded, the United States Navy's protocol for battle damage assessment and search and rescue was now in full effect. The destroyer DDG-51, the USS Arleigh Burke, slowed to a speed of 5 knots as it entered the primary debris field. The air around the ship was heavy and suffocating, smelling of burnt rubber, high-octane gasoline, and the acrid tang of charred fiberglass. On the bridge of the destroyer, the commanding officer used high-powered optics to survey the devastation. The water was littered with white fragments of hull plating, orange life vests, and the twisted remains of 12.7mm machine guns. Every few hundred yards, the blackened hull of a bog hummer fast boat sat low in the water, hissing, as the hot metal met the sea. The systematic assessment was a grim necessity. In the Combat Direction Center of the Nimitz, the tactical action officer, cross-referenced radar logs with visual confirmations from the MH-60 Sierra helicopters hovering above. The final count was finalized. 36 Iranian fast attack craft were confirmed destroyed, with 4 more disabled and abandoned by their crews. Of the 40 vessels that had initiated the swarm, not a single one remained a functional combat threat. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had lost nearly an entire regional coastal defense squadron in less than 25 minutes. On the carrier itself, damage control teams in their red jerseys conducted a skin-to-skin inspection of the hull. The results were a testament to the lopsided nature of the engagement. The Nimitz had sustained 0 structural damage. A few dozen marks from 12.7mm rounds were found on the thick steel of the starboard side, but they had failed to do more than chip the gray paint. No personnel on the carrier or its escort ships had been killed or wounded. The wall of steel defense had functioned exactly as designed, intercepting every threat before it could close to a range where its weapons could be effective. However, the human cost on the other side was severe. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, Hunter 1-2 and Hunter 1-4, began a low-level sweep for survivors. The pilots reported dozens of Iranian sailors in the water, clinging to debris or floating in their life jackets. Following the laws of the sea and the standing orders of the United States Navy, the admiral commanding the strike group authorized a limited search and rescue operation. The cruiser CG-73, the USS Lake Erie, was designated as the primary rescue platform, deploying its rigid-hull inflatable boats to recover the survivors. The scene in the water was one of absolute chaos and exhaustion. The Iranian sailors, many of them suffering from burns or shock, were pulled from the oily water by American sailors in blue coveralls and life vests. The language barrier was bridged by hand signals and the professional, clinical efficiency of the Navy corpsmen. 28 survivors were eventually brought aboard the Lake Erie, where they were searched, provided with medical treatment, and placed under guard. The unanswered question of their original intent remained, but for now, the priority was the stabilization of the local environment. The logistical reality of the engagement began to settle in. On the flight deck of the Nimitz, the 2 FA-18 Super Hornets of Ravenflight were recovered, their tailhooks catching the 3-wire with a violent, sparking jolt. As the pilots climbed out of their cockpits, they were met by crews already preparing to refuel and rearm the aircraft. The strike group had expended nearly 2,000 rounds of 25mm ammunition, 5,000 rounds of 20mm tungsten, and 6 Hellfire missiles. The replenishment of these stocks would be handled during the next scheduled underway replenishment, but for now, the magazines remained at 85% capacity. 11 in the morning. The Persian Gulf sun was now directly overhead, turning the surface of the water into a blinding mirror. The smoke from the burning wrecks was beginning to dissipate, carried away by a light breeze from the northwest. The USS Nimitz signaled the rest of the strike group to resume standard cruising formation. The destroyer and cruiser moved back into their screening positions, 3 miles ahead and 2 miles astern of the carrier. The professional calm of the strike group was a stark contrast to the violence of the morning. In the officers' wardroom and the sailors' mess decks, the conversation was quiet and focused on the technical aspects of the fight. There was no sense of celebration, only the quiet satisfaction of a mission executed according to the highest standards of the United States Navy. The battle damage assessment was complete, the survivors were accounted for, and the strike group was once again a cohesive, lethal unit moving toward its next objective. 11:30 in the morning. The aircraft carrier, USS Nimitz, was once again cutting a clean, white wake through the deep green waters of the Persian Gulf. At coordinates 26 degrees 36 minutes north, longitude 55 degrees 34 minutes east, the tactical environment had returned to a state of guarded stability. The black smoke from the earlier engagement had faded into a thin, gray haze on the western horizon, leaving the sea to look as though the violence of the morning had never occurred. The commanding officer of the USS Nimitz stood at the central navigation console, his eyes fixed on the digital display of the surrounding waters. Carrier Strike Group 11 was now assuming a modified diamond formation, with the cruiser CG-73 leading the way toward the Strait of Hormuz. The air on the bridge was cool and pressurized, but the metallic smell of spent gunpowder still seemed to cling to the flight suits of the officers who had recently returned from their stations. Inside the flag bridge, the admiral reviewed the finalized mission report. The data was clinical and absolute. At 9:40 in the morning, 40 Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy fast attack craft had initiated a coordinated, high-speed swarm attack against the carrier. By 10:15, every single one of those 40 vessels had been neutralized. 36 boats were confirmed destroyed, their fiberglass hulls shattered and sunk, while 4 were left as drifting, abandoned wrecks. The United States Navy had sustained 0 casualties and 0 structural damage to its capital ships. The engagement was a definitive demonstration of the Wall of Steel doctrine. The strike group had expended exactly 1,840 rounds of 25mm high-explosive ammunition, 4,200 rounds of 20mm tungsten from the Phalanx systems, and 6 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. Each weapon system had performed within its designed parameters, proving that even a massive saturation attack by small surface craft could be dismantled by a disciplined, multi-layered defense. The 28 Iranian survivors recovered from the water were now being processed in the holding areas of the cruiser Lake Erie. Under the supervision of the Master-at-Arms and a team of Navy linguists, the prisoners were provided with dry clothing and basic rations. The Admiral issued a formal notification to the Iranian Coast Guard via the International Distress Frequency, providing the exact coordinates of the debris field and the survivors. The United States Navy had no intention of holding the personnel longer than necessary for identification and medical stabilization. The goal was the safe transit of the carrier, not the escalation of a regional conflict. The unanswered question that had hung over the bridge at sunrise, whether the swarm was a bluff or a legitimate strike, had been answered with the weight of thousands of rounds of ammunition. The Iranian commanders had tested the resolve of the 7th Fleet and found it to be unbreakable. On the flight deck, the final Super Hornet of the morning's combat air patrol was lowered on the elevator into the hangar bay. The mechanics began the process of inspecting the airframes for any signs of stress or debris ingestion, their movements quick and certain. The professional discipline of the 5,000 sailors aboard the Nimitz remained the ship's greatest asset. In the mess decks, the noon meal was being served, as if the engagement had been nothing more than a scheduled training exercise. The only difference was the subtle, shared look of understanding between the sailors, who had manned the guns and the technicians who had tracked the targets. They had faced a legitimate threat in one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world, and had emerged entirely victorious. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the USS Nimitz increased its speed to 28 knots. The carrier was moving toward the narrow throat of the Strait of Hormuz, the gateway back to the open waters of the Arabian Sea. The escort ships adjusted their positions, their radars continuing to sweep the horizon for any sign of a second attempt. But the Iranian coastal stations remained quiet, their sensors likely tracking the departure of the group that had just decimated their local naval strength. The mission report was encrypted and transmitted to the Pentagon and Pacific Command. It was a document of technical precision, detailing the exact moment every trigger was squeezed and every target was eliminated. The United States Navy had maintained the freedom of navigation through the Persian Gulf, ensuring that the vital sea lanes remained open despite the aggressive posture of a regional adversary. The USS Nimitz, a 97,000-ton symbol of American power, disappeared into the heat haze of the horizon, its mission continuing without further interruption.